Hey there folks, the number one Charly Bliss fan from the Infinite Jukebox here with another album review, and today I wanted to talk about the new Charly Bliss record, Forever. Charly Bliss have been a fairly beloved power pop band over the course of the past handful of years for fairly good reason, if I'm being completely honest. After all, their 2017 first full-length LP, Guppy, is considered a modern cult classic of melody and melodicism forward focused types of indie rock, depending on who you ask, of course. And at the same time, their 2019 sophomore studio album, Young Enough, while not necessarily as popular, certainly isn't a weak record by any means, and manages to stand on its own as ensuring that the band did not fall into a sophomore slump of any kind. So generally speaking, we've kind of been 2 for 2 in the Charly Bliss discography up to this point, and now here we are with their latest studio album and their first full-length studio album in 5 years, Forever, and things change for the most part for the worse, unfortunately. The main big change that occurs on Forever that manages to individualize it from the first two full-length Charly Bliss projects is that it feels like the band's most pop-oriented record to date, and that's kind of saying something considering they've always been a pop band, or at the very least a pop-oriented band at heart. But unlike this studio album, I feel like the first two albums that Charly Bliss put out were kind of more of a sort of Big Star or maybe even Jellyfish kind of oriented power pop that managed to successfully combine a lot of indie rock and underground music influences with pop song structure to create something that was very strong, even if in Charly Bliss's context it wasn't necessarily the most unique in the world. However, on the other hand, Forever kind of dabbles in this synth pop sort of sound that has always kind of underlined Charly Bliss's general discography, but takes it to an extent that the band has never really worked with before, and in turn, I just feel like the experimentation being put on display here isn't nearly as successful as it was when it was incorporated in a more subtle manner in the past. It just feels like this album being kind of a transitional record for the band as they continue to more heavily embrace these more synth-oriented influences winds up causing things to just feel maybe a little bit clunky, a little bit undercooked, generally speaking. A lot of these synth leads in particular throughout the album don't really feel nearly that punchy, and at the same time, I can't ever really say that they work in a more laid-back setting either. There's never any moment where the synths really sell this album and make it a record that manages to succeed as a very synth-laden Charly Bliss album, and I really think that's a shame because I feel like in one way or another, synths could have done some great stuff as a leading role in this band, but in the moments where they are these more impactful instruments, I don't really think they have a huge amount of impact, and in the moments where they are meant to sort of dial things back and provide more ambience above all else, I don't necessarily think they really succeed in doing anything interesting in that regard either. It doesn't help that some of the better qualities of Charly Bliss's music from a more behind-the-scenes kind of perspective isn't necessarily present here either. I mean, the production on Forever feels a bit flat sonically and certainly doesn't give any particular benefit to some already sort of mismatched and at times thrown together synth-based instrumentals, and I feel like the really catchy pop songwriting that the band have had since day one, basically, is just not super present here, with a lot of the work here coming across as entirely unmemorable, which I'll touch on more in a moment, but I digress. I feel like a lot of Charly Bliss's best qualities just aren't in active play here, and that's kind of a shame because it almost defeats the purpose of a Charly Bliss album. And I don't want to convey the idea that the concepts being put forward on this album are inherently bad or anything like that, because, like I said, Charly Bliss as a trio have worked with these sounds in the past, these exact sounds, in a very modernized, subtle way, but here things are more pop-based than ever before, and as they lose some of those more traditional indie rock bits of grounding, it leads to them feeling significantly less successful in delivering on those synth influences. There's a certain irony in some of the more interesting low-key qualities of their older material being some of the worst and most thrown-together qualities of their most recent LP, but it's just kind of a shame at the end of the day. So yeah, the ideas on Forever aren't necessarily horrible on their own. In fact, a lot of the ideas that are presented here are ideas that Charly Bliss are not unfamiliar with or anything like that. I just can't help but feel like the increase in focus and attention on these synth influences that were particularly well incorporated on the previously mentioned Young Enough back in 2019 are just a little bit too much. It just feels like they don't necessarily know what to do with that increase in synth influence at this point in their career. And while I do hope that if they continue to go in this direction, that they may kind of find a bit more of a proper niche for themselves with this newer direction that they are trying to go in, but as it stands, I don't know, just the first album here within this more uniquely pop kind of style, it just feels a bit clunky. And I mean, musically speaking, the record doesn't feel like much of interest either. I mean, it is at least worth mentioning that Eva Hendrix's vocal work has never ceased to be solid and impressive, with songs on here like How Do You Do It and Last First Kiss in particular basically being carried by her charisma and personality behind the mic, which she certainly does have, being a bit of a standout of power pop vocalists at the moment. But musically speaking, instrumentally speaking, a lot of these songs just don't feel like they have that much to write home about. Again, not that the guitar work or the rhythm section is bad or doing anything that could be hugely improved upon or anything like that. It just feels like the bass instrumentals that are being presented here aren't really that interesting in the first place, with a lot of tracks here feeling entirely unmemorable from multiple perspectives. A lack of distinctiveness could at least arguably be traced back to the poor structuring of individual tracks on this record compared to some of their previous works. I mean, it just doesn't really feel like there are that many standout hooks or choruses that really grab you as the listener and draw you into the record. And that's not to say that Charly Bliss don't ever really try to pull that off or anything like that, and there even are a couple of moments where they sort of succeed. I mean, the song Back There Now manages to succeed in that regard. The aforementioned Last First Kiss, again, succeeds in the regard of being memorable, but that's only a couple of songs in a 12-song long track list, and I just feel that while there is still an equal focus on melodies, choruses, and hooks compared to those of their first two studio albums, this album feels much weaker in that regard, with nothing really standing out. I mean, even when there were weaker tracks on albums like Guppy, you could at least say that you remembered them and that they stood out as fairly solid tracks nonetheless from a structural standpoint. But even the best songs on Forever, I don't necessarily know I can say that about. There just isn't a lot that really sticks to me here on this record, even after multiple listens. It feels really bizarre to say that because Charly Bliss have always rightfully been kind of seen as a band for people who enjoy melodies, good hooks, good choruses, because at the end of the day, that's what they've always really been. I mean, a band with strong instrumentation and strong songwriting, but above all else, extremely confident and competent song structuring, and it feels so weird to say that that doesn't really apply here. And if anything, I would actually argue that the lack of notable moments that really draw you in as a listener here on Forever manages to highlight some of their weaker qualities as a band even more than they otherwise would be. I mean, they've never really been the best from a songwriting perspective, even if they are solid, as I said. They've never really been particularly amazing in terms of instrumental tones that really stand out as unique from other power pop, indie rock, indie pop rock kind of bands like Charly Bliss, etc., etc. These qualities that one could possibly perceive as a negative, even on their better works, are really emphasized here on this record with no particular amount of hooks or choruses to distract you by showing off their better qualities as a group. It just feels like this album falters in the one way that a Charly Bliss album should never really fail in, and in turn a lot of weaker qualities of the band are highlighted. Not qualities that make this album awful, but nonetheless qualities that do kind of demonstrate how finicky, I guess you could say, a Charly Bliss album really can be when they try to go in a slightly different direction from what their fan base already knows. With all of that being said, I will say this, it's not the worst album in the world or anything like that. It just feels like a letdown from a band that are trying to do something new. And while I respect that, and I do think that they will probably be able to kind of rein things in, manage to hone in on this synth-based sound even more in the future, and possibly kill it on a follow-up studio album to this record, Forever is the definition of a transitional record in the sense that it feels like they're doing something that could potentially be maybe interesting, but it just isn't quite there yet. And as it stands, this is an album that just feels a bit too rough at times. The synths don't really stick out. The instrumentals are not particularly interesting in any way. Eva Hendricks is a solid vocalist, but at the same time, there's no really great choruses or hooks for her to sing to show off her personality behind the mic, thus kind of nullifying that entire quality of this record, at least to an extent. So on and so forth. It's an album that's full of a lot of mediocrity and not a lot of bad, but definitely not much good either. But I will say, overall, this isn't really a bad album by any means. It's just a record that manages to come across as a bit too transitional for its own good. I mean, this is an album made by a band that are trying to do at least something new with their sound, and while that is admirable from a creative standpoint, and at least somewhat interesting, at least in concept, the actual execution of these sounds feels a bit tossed together, sort of. A lot of the synth leads feel kind of rough around the edges in a way that doesn't really work in a DIY sense, but more in, again, as I've said a few times in this review, a bit of a clunky sense. Eva Hendricks' vocal work is solid, but when she isn't given some really strong hooks or choruses to sing, it sort of nullifies and voids that really positive quality of the band, at least to an extent. And meanwhile, the instrumentals don't really manage to add up to anything of particular note either. There's just a lot of mediocrity strewn about this record, and not a lot of bad, except just not a lot of good either. A couple of solid tracks in a sea of entirely unmemorable and unnotable songs from a band that at one point was pretty much anything but unmemorable. I will still say that if you are a pre-existing Charly Bliss fan, hey, give this one a shot. You might like it more than I do, but as for myself, I can't really get into it, and I think I can at the very least speak for a lot of people who are already fans of Charly Bliss when I say that if you are a newcomer to this band and you want to get into them, just go listen to Guppy, man. Why are you here? Don't start with this, please. I'm begging you. I'm going to give this record 2.5 stars out of 5. With that being said, that is the end of this album review. Thank you for watching The Infinite Jukebox, and I'll see you in the next one.